Welcome to Things Musicians Don't Talk About with me, your host Hattie Butterworth. I'm a cellist and writer in my final year at the Royal College of Music in London, and I think we need a new way of talking. I've spent many years feeling in the dark about issues in the classical music profession. So often it can feel like you're the only person struggling with anxiety, depression, career doubts, money, injuries, and so much more. Who do we go to when we feel we've had enough for whatever reason? Join me and guests as we end the stigma with honest conversations about the things musicians don't talk about. Hello everyone, how are you all? Welcome back. I just wanted to say before we start the interview with Frank that I've been so overwhelmed by the lovely messages I've received from so many different people. I wasn't expecting as many new people to follow us on Instagram and share your stories with me, so thank you for that. It's been really uplifting to hear how many of you think that this is a good idea, and please keep sharing your stories with me and ideas. Let's keep this going. In this episode, I interview the pianist and composer Frank Horvat. I had such a fascinating conversation with Frank. We talked about so many things, from his depression and the ways he's learnt to manage it over the years, to what it means to be a musician with a mental health problem today and in the past, and the ways in which we can open up and manage our symptoms. He also talks about the fascinating ways in which he's managed to open up to his students, which I find very inspiring, and talking to them about his condition as if it were a health problem, like any other health problem. We also talk about his work as an activist in the arts and lobbying for human rights and environmental action through music making. He has undertaken many wonderful projects in the past. Anyway, I really hope you enjoyed today's episode. Please do follow us on Instagram at TMDTA podcast. And without further ado, let's get on to the interview with Frank. Frank, thank you so much for joining us. It's so wonderful to have you as the first guest on the podcast. Reading your blog has been such a fascinating process. I found myself feeling just so reassured by your honesty, which is just something, for some reason, is quite hard to come by, and especially about your struggles with mental health. And I just wanted to say that, do you realise I searched for quite a long time trying to find an article online in which a classical musician sort of talked openly about mental health. And I mean, in the first sort of 3 or 4 pages of Google, you were the only person I could find, which was quite shocking to me. I don't know whether you knew that.
Well, I in the past couple of years, I have been very fortunate to have people such as yourself reach out to me and tell me similar stories. So, I feel honored and privileged, but also at the same time slightly concerned that more of our colleagues aren't talking more openly about this, because obviously we know from a lot of research and data that there's a lot of people out there that, especially in our world of classical music, that are very much struggling with these issues, like many other facets of society.
I want to talk more about mental health in a moment, but I just thought maybe you could explain to everyone at the start a bit about yourself and what you do at the moment.
Sure. Yeah, I'm a composer, pianist, and music educator based here in Toronto, Canada, and I'm in my mid-40s right now, and this is something that basically I've been a musician since the age of 5, either studying or professionally in those capacities. For many years, I've used music, my creative musical voice, as an outlet to share things that are very important to me and that I feel passionate about, be it issues around human rights or environmentalism. Up until just a few years ago, I was very hesitant to talk about openly and honestly about my mental health challenges, and B, definitely not using my music as a platform to share that. But thankfully, I've sort of feel like I've come a full way in a path to managing my depression, and because of many years of hard work on it and focus on it, now I feel like in the last few years, really 2017 specifically, is when I finally sort of took the plunge, so to speak,
Yeah.
creatively, and allowed the music to reflect that. And then in turn, because the music was out there, I started talking more openly or publicly about it. So
It's such a important thing, I think, because I think a lot of people might start to feel similar ways at a very young age. I mean, for me, it was the start of my undergrad when I was about 18. And yes, I heard, a few people in their 40s talking about it, but it felt like for everyone around me, all the musicians around me, we can't talk about it. It has to be something that is kept inside. But I just was wondering whether you could talk about your personal experience with your mental health, and when did you notice that you first had a problem?
oh, that's a challenging question to answer because of the fact that you live in denial for so many
Yeah.
years, right? And you live in denial and you sort of have to try to go back and figure out, well, was there sort of specific moments? I don't think so. I don't think it's very dramatic. I feel for myself personally, it was sort of festering for many years. I really think that it probably started in my teenage years, when life became very demanding. I mean, life for any teenager is very demanding, but I think for musicians like us who are practicing hours on end, taking lessons, going to school at the same time. For people that might have financial constraints, maybe having a part-time job or even trying to pay for things. These are all very time demanding things in the competitive world we live in. I think I started to put a lot of weight on myself, emotional and mental weight.
Yeah.
And it's really interesting because I grew up in a very loving household, very, very supportive parents. To this day, my parents are my number one fans and I love them dearly. So it wasn't like I was getting pressure from other people, although we do live in a classical music world where sometimes, there can be a lot of pressure coming from families and parents and stuff like that. But for me, it was very much always on myself. I am my greatest critic, to this day. You can be very, very hard on yourself, and there's nothing wrong with being constructive with yourself, but you have to walk a fine line and find balance. So, and in those early years, there was no balance. It was all hyper manic, just focused on, okay, I achieved something, but that's not good enough because I still have to get to the next level, the next level, the next level. A human being can only take so much of that before you start to see cracks.
It's a very relatable place you come from, I think, because for me as well, I mean, I just had such a source of shame coming from my mental health problems because my family was so supportive and no one in my family had really talked about it before, but everyone was just, it was like such a supportive unit that I felt like an outlier and like I shouldn't be struggling and I shouldn't be talking about it because it wasn't something that was part of me. It was an alien kind of construct. I just was wondering, sort of, if you could talk about the things you turned to manage your depression and what did the recovery process look like for you?
So for me, the number one important step that I took to recovery was admitting to myself that I have an issue, I have a condition, and that it's treatable. And that was the hardest. That was absolutely the hardest. It wasn't to talk to open up either to my loved ones or to a therapist or even publicly. I actually find all of that stuff, since I took that crucial first step, to be the easiest, very easy, compared to just admitting it to myself. even though my loved ones were encouraging me to seek help because they could see something is wrong, I would just not listen. And it took many, many years. It was maybe, until I was well into my 30s, that I sort of figured it out that this is not the right way to live, and that I deserve to be happy, and I deserve to be fulfilled despite whatever type of world as a musician I live in, whether I have ups or downs or successes or failures or whatever, or rejection or promotion, it didn't matter. So once I did that, then I was home free. It was almost, even though there was still a long road ahead, because that was sort of like the turning point. And then I worked with a psychotherapist for quite a long time and found that whole experience to be quite valuable. And then I also did quite a bit of work on myself physically, making sure that I was physically healthy. And it's fascinating because now we live in a world where the medical profession is studying the links between mental and physical health. And back then, I didn't know anything about this, but I just knew that if I was outside, if I was going for a walk or going for a run or spending time in green space away from music, with no earbuds in my ear, not listening to anything, and just experiencing and enjoying nature, that would be a huge thing. And then I also discovered meditation. Meditation has been an important practice that I've discovered only in the last 3 or 4 years, and I've added that into my sort of my daily life routine. And being a person who's always thinking, just like thinking about music, thinking about melodies going through my head, composer, it's like, you have to calm the mind, and the mind has to take a break. And so this was my ability to do that. And diet's been absolutely huge. Changing my diet in the last 15, 20 years, has really made a difference. When there's definitely a correlation. The odd time I eat bad food, there's a reason why I feel depressed. So I think our body is a machine, and it's all, everything we put in or take out is all interrelated. So thinking of everything as a whole and interconnected, and thinking of it holistically that way.
Um, I'm also just wondering if you could explain to people a bit about what your depression feels like. I mean, it's not something that's easy to put into words, I know, and I know you've done amazing things with putting it into music, but I just wondered if you could describe it, how you would describe it.
I guess the first thing I would describe it as, if I have to pick one word, is emptiness. There's just this awful, awful feeling of no feeling. There's been a lot of surveys done. I don't know if you've heard of this survey that actually came out of the UK maybe a few years ago, comparing different professions and which ones were most prone to depression. And unfortunately, our way of life is the one that would report it the most. And I often wonder that what makes us so prone to this, as a community. And I think that because we're in the business of feeling all the time,
Mm.
as musicians, that's what we do. We need to feel. We need to evoke feeling. We need others to feel. And I think depression is maybe a manic way of sort of like going the polar opposite, and it goes too far the deep end because we're always working so hard to emote. And of course, we could have trauma. Any individual person can have specific traumas or scarring things in their life that happen that can just trigger it randomly. But I think sometimes I'm on such an incredible high and adrenaline of putting out an album or getting feedback from people about it or performing a concert, and you just crash, and you just can't feel anything, and you're
Mm.
crawling to try to get to this happy medium, you know what I mean, of where you're not anywhere on the pendulum. It's sort of just right down the middle, and for me, that's always been the big challenge. And even sometimes when things are going great, I just, my body but can't help but just crash the other way. And it has been, I've gone through periods where I can't get out of it for weeks,
Yeah.
I've been stuck there. Thankfully, the length of these periods in which I'm in a state of emptiness, it doesn't happen very often anymore. But when I am able to get out of it far quicker. But that's what it feels like. And when it was really bad at its apex, it was literally weeks that I just couldn't crawl out. And then the more you want to get out of it, the more you try to encourage yourself, come on, you can do this. Then, of course, there's the pressure. And also trying to put a brave face on it. That puts extra strain on the whole thing. Perhaps you're trying to have a big smile on your face, or perhaps in my position as a music educator, working with a whole bunch of students on a particular day, well, you don't want them to know about this. You don't want them to see this. So you have to pretend to be something you're not. And the more you're pretending to be something you're not, or what your true self is emotionally at that given moment, of course, is further trauma to your system. So it's sort of, it can be very tough that way. I think we have those added layers where it's not just the issue itself of being down, but then it's the pressure you put on yourself to get out of it, and also sometimes the need to just turn it off. That's not healthy, but we don't, as musicians, we often don't have that luxury. We have to put it aside for a sec, and then we'll get back to this depression thing later, which of course is
Yeah.
not right.
I mean, I definitely have been in situations where I know I have a stressful period of concerts or performances, and my mental health is feeling, fragile. And just the idea that I'm going to have to pretend to one audience after another, or one group of beautiful people I meet organizing the concert after another, that I'm fine and that I'm settled. That is for me quite a triggering situation, and it makes it even more difficult to accept the situation you're in and accept your mental health problem when every situation you meet, you also feel this absolute shame for not being your true self.
Do you feel in those kind of situations like you can't control your feeling of vulnerability?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
That's a big thing for me too.
Mm.
And the magic on my road to managing all
Mm.
this is been to take vulnerability as a fear. It's a fear mechanism that it can be, and I've tried to turn it around that vulnerability is actually something that I use to my advantage. To be in front of an audience, and not just, yes, you need to be confident as a performer to be in front of an audience, but as a true artist, there's also something to be said about vulnerability as a good thing, and trying to balance that between the confidence of doing the technique that's required to execute the performance, but also that. So for me, I think writing music about mental health and then performing that music and talking about it like we are today, this is all wonderful therapy for me. And that's why what you're doing, your podcast, is a fantastic endeavor, because hopefully people will listen to this, and then it will motivate them to talk themselves like you and I are talking right
Yeah.
now. I think that's the huge thing.
I'm so with you on that, and it just reminded me as well of not a podcast, a blog post that you wrote, which I think is probably the most poignant moment of my week almost. It was when you talked about your 10-year-old student you had who wanted to come to your concert, that was based on your piano pieces written about your depression, and their mum spoke to you and said, is this going to be a suitable concert for my son? And you just talked in such an amazing way about why it's important to talk to young people about it as if it were just another illness. Because this is something, and especially in classical music, it's very difficult to be vulnerable. It's very difficult to say to people that look up to us, yes, I'm also struggling. I'm not, even though I'm on stage, that doesn't necessarily mean that I'm a totally secure person all the time. And I've just been thinking about that blog an awful lot, and whether you ever thought that opening up like the way you did would damage your career or damage your reputation with children. Has that ever crossed your mind or something you've dealt with?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I've been teaching piano and music for many years, going concurrent to my performing and composing life. And, as a independent freelance musician, we need to earn a living to pay bills and so forth. And teaching is a very important aspect of my life, and it's something that I take a lot of pride in, is being the best teacher I can be to my students. And so, one of the things about teaching is that which is very different than performing, is that performing, it's all about me, the performer or the composer. But teaching is the complete opposite. You as a performer composer have to completely shut that off and put everything on the student, right? And making sure that they're comfortable, they're
Mm-hmm.
motivated, they're organized. So when the mother of that student you talk about told me, yes, we'd like to come to the concert, gosh, that was one of the hardest sort of moments, spur of the moment things that have ever happened in my career, because it was like I had to explain to her what the concert was going to be about. And I did the concert. The child attended. I think he might have been about 10 or 11 at that point. And I knew he was in the audience. There was many people in the audience, from various walks of my life or various members of the public. But knowing that he was in the audience was very challenging, and it sort of stuck in the back of my mind as I performed the pieces, my compositions, and talked in between the pieces about that. Even though I was talking to the audience as a general, I was sort of thinking about, how do I talk to him? What was interesting about that whole scenario is the week after the concert, when my student came for his next lesson, he told me how much he very much enjoyed the concert. And he's not a chatty type of student. And I remember talking to him about it, and it was really for the first time when I talked openly, very openly and honestly, one on one with a person about thinking of mental health as a health issue. I was talking to my student about it in a very, very objective way, and we were talking about mental health or the issues I've had, just as if I was to tell a child that I had a heart condition or I had cancer or that kind of thing. And I've talked about how, in an objective way, how this has been a challenging thing in my life, but I've gone to medical professionals to get help, and now I'm doing better. And he nodded and was very calmly, receiving that. And I thought to myself, this is so invigorating and enlightening, because if you can talk to a child about this, that and they grow up thinking that mental having a mental health issue is not something that you should be ashamed of, or that you should hide, or that you are not a great person, that this is something like, if I fall off my bike and I go to the hospital and get a cast, this is a similar type of situation. And I thought to myself, my gosh, this 10-year-old boy has given me this other building block of thinking that I'm going to be okay, and anybody else is going to deal with this is also going to be okay. And side note, the student is still my student. This student we're talking about, and we have this wonderful relationship, and he's advancing. He's so super talented, and so obviously it didn't affect my relationship with him or his family. In fact, it probably strengthened it that I showed my vulnerability in that situation.
Yeah, I mean, it reminded me about, all of those, especially at the moment with the Black Lives Matter movement, we see time and time again examples of where children aren't the ones that discriminate. Children don't have the judgments and the learned behaviors that we might have. And I think that opening up in the way you did is almost just adding to that whole, it just proves that whole truth that children are going to respect the person that you are if you portray yourself to them in a respectful way as well.
You're absolutely right. I read a book recently by the Dalai Lama, and he basically very bluntly stated, nobody's born a racist,
Yeah.
It's true, no one is born a racist. No one is born with sort of preconceived notions. That's why we as adults have so much to learn from children, especially younger children, because they look at the world quite objectively and in almost this matter-of-fact, nonchalant type of way. And we have to keep adopting that and not worrying about what people think of us. And that's obviously a lot easier said than done. My big dream in life is to visit schools, and visit universities. And I've been fortunate to give talks on this topic to some institutions, but I really want to go deep in, and I think sort of try to get every school of music to have a very important component of what students are offered, and even specific programs that's part of the curriculum as part of attaining your degree has to be working on these aspects, because that didn't exist when I was in school. I was in university studying music in the 90s, and these things just did not exist. And I'm hoping that because we're talking about it so much and there's more emphasis on this within our society, I hope that we start to make these changes.
Yeah, I mean, even in the past 4 years, for me, since I started suffering, I feel like the conversation has just grown and grown. And there are things that
Good.
exist now that didn't exist when I started. And I mean, that was only 4 years ago. And it's just amazing the change that's happening. But thank you.
This is great. I'm really happy to hear that,
Yeah.
because we definitely need to keep hearing that, And now I hope that some of the leaders within the classical music community, they are the ones who start talking about this more. So, as we're talking now, I mean, the world is entrenched with COVID, and because people are more isolated now, I'm just concerned that maybe these types of things will not be discussed as much, or maybe because now even life as a musician is even more scarce because of this, people not talking about their issues more, or do they have the resources available? I think this is very, very important. We have to look out for this, because once the pandemic lifts, who knows when it will be, but when it lifts and we can sort of return to this type of thing, will people be in a position to be able to go back to activities they love? And my fear is that some permanent damage won't be done where it might be very difficult for them. So I think now more than ever, we have to make sure that we emphasize this.
I agree. I'm sad to say I won't be surprised if there are more people who come forward saying that they're starting to suffer with mental health problems or whatever in our industry after this pandemic, because it's just the ultimate instability, isn't it? I mean, what is it? 80% of musicians are freelancing, and obviously that doesn't exist at the moment. So it's going to have a knock-on effect. And I think we have to be real and honest about that now and say that you aren't alone. People are not alone. And if people start discovering they are experiencing symptoms, whatever they might be, that they have the faith to seek help.
Absolutely. That's the big thing. We always talk about ending the stigma around mental health. Well, that's the number one stigma. Admitting you have a mental health issue is still, for many, many people, is a thing that somehow a statement of their character,
Yes.
rather than a genuine medical condition that can be treated and managed, right? And I think we still, as much as I've been talking about it very openly these last few years, I still come across people that that I know for a fact are either think that way about others who are going through it or who are suffering about it, and they've bought into that stigma, you know. So there's still a lot of work we have to do about that for sure.
Yeah. I've been listening this morning to the wonderful album you have on your Spotify, which is called You Haven't Been, which are piano pieces that you wrote about your depression. And I was just wondering what the composition process was like for that album. And I was just struck with how hopeful so many of the pieces were to me. They felt, you know, some of them felt very sad, but some of them felt extremely hopeful. And if you could explain the composition process, whether you wrote it whilst you were going through your depression or whether it was a sort of reflection on the depressive episodes, or if you could just explain a bit more about it.
Well, it's definitely not so, you know, the clear cut. Oh, I was going through depression. I all of a sudden felt better, and so now I'm going to write a piece about it. You know, it's like to this day, I still have good days and I have bad days, right? Thankfully, much fewer bad days than there once was. But I can definitely still go through that. And that was no different than composing many of those pieces. Some of those pieces were definitely composed when I was in a state of depression. Very few, actually. Remarkably, the interesting thing about, for me at least, I don't know about others, but the interesting thing about me being depressed is that I really don't feel like doing music. By the way, here's another stigma and we look at this in famous composers and things like that. You know, you listen to Chopin. Oh my gosh, you know, it's so melancholy and sad and blue. He must have been so sad when he was writing it. Well, how do we know that? We've just created this story to sort of romanticize, you know, depression that he might have went through. For me, I know that I can't do it because, you know what, as I said before, I feel empty. I don't feel like doing anything.
Exactly.
So it's not like I feel, because I'm depressed, now I feel inspired and I'm going to go and I'm going to be creative and I'm going to compose, you know, and it's like I'm going to bring out all this incredible melancholy music. No, there we go. That's what I was talking about before, the stigma around it as part of, it's almost like a choice that I've made to be depressed so then I can be inspired. You know, it's like, this is all, you know, bull, you know, pardon my language. So a lot of those pieces, it was more, definitely to answer your question, it was more of a reflection of being in a state and looking back on it. And that was a very therapeutic thing. And they were actually very easy pieces to compose. They're not actually very difficult to play. They very simply state feelings through the sound of the piano, reflections of how I felt in those particular times. And that's why whenever I get an opportunity to perform those pieces live, it's sort of like an extension of that creative process when I was composing the pieces, because it's like one step further, a more of a reflection to play them and to talk about the pieces and what inspired the particular themes of the specific pieces. So, but remarkably, it was very therapeutic. And I was worried when I was writing it, and once the whole collection was done, I remember talking to my wife, who's also my manager, thinking, okay, how are we going to share this music? And am I taking a risk here by putting out an album about being in a state of depression? You know, and what I was most worried about wasn't just, I'm not so much worried about what people would perceive of me or the music. I was more concerned about, would I be making people depressed? So we actually did a lot of research online from many mental health studies talking about, does music on melancholy, sad, or depressing themes make people more sad when they listen to it? And everything that we read, thankfully, told us, no, it's actually the opposite. that so I finally figured out after all these years, why is Chopin so darn popular? Well, there you go. It's like, even though, I mean, so much of his music just conveys this sadness or sati. I mean, so many wonderful composers we love to listen to, and that people who don't even know much about classical music, they're just drawn to that music, that repertoire, right? And it makes sense because there's something welcoming, comfortable, soothing, that ironically can help bring people out of it. Like anything I compose, I take a very artistic approach to my practice, and that is I only compose and will put out there what music that moves me or that is a reflection of me. That's a very strong thing, whatever I compose. And but that obviously was taking that to a whole other level, and to see the reaction has been quite amazing. So I'm happy that I got over the inhibition of that, and it's gone further with it. So
I kind of want to turn now to talk about your work as an activist in the arts, because it feels very frequently like being sort of quote unquote outspoken about issues around mental health or climate change and human rights. It's not best practice within our profession. And I've even had, a few friends who say, I'm scared to write my opinions on Twitter or to retweet something I care about because it'll look unprofessional, or it'll look like I'm not centrist enough. Don't fit the mold of being a classical musician enough. And I just thought I'd like to hear your thoughts about why you think it's important for musicians to speak out about these issues.
oh gosh, there's so much I could say on this. First thing is, okay, you know how a big thing in our classical music world is, are we still relevant? That is a big talking point, right? How can an art form based on traditional white European traditions still be relevant in a world that we live in? And probably you and maybe many people listening to this podcast probably feel, yes, we are still relevant, right? After all, that's why we're participating in this, and this is why we do it. So we do feel a relevance. So if we do feel a relevance, though, then we have to relate to the world we live in. I mean, it's a no-brainer. So I was cringing when you were telling me about your friend or somebody, your colleague, who was like, I don't want to post anything on Twitter that I believe in, and I was just like shuddering. It's like, but you're an artist. You have things to say, right? As artists, we are wired to say something, to get on a stage or a platform or an album and to share. And for me personally, I feel that it's just an extension of that. My music is my number one way I share who I am as an individual and what I believe in, and using then platforms like social media to share that even further, or to supplement that, is just a natural extension of who I am. So I'm fearful, maybe being a bit bold here, but I would actually question the artistry of somebody who doesn't feel that they can speak out of certain things, because then I would question, well, what are you trying to say in your own performance? Because for me, in the human brain, I feel it's all interconnected. Whether you're using a musical instrument, your singing voice, a tweet, an album, a live concert, for me, it's all the same. We have been placed on this planet as musicians to share and communicate. That's what music is. It's a form of communication. So I do respect some people who don't feel like they don't feel comfortable. Perhaps they like using their instrument only to say something because they don't feel comfortable with a Twitter post or a blog or something. And I respect that. I do respect that. But at least then use your music to say something. Use program notes if you don't want to talk in between the pieces of your concert, and you only want to say something relevant and important to make this world a better place. Then say it through the sound of your instrument and the repertoire you pick. Who wrote the repertoire? Do you have proper representation? And I'm a person, you might think, oh, I'm a white male of European descent. You know what I mean? From my family comes from the hotbed of classical music tradition and history. I have nothing to lose. In fact, I want more diverse voices to be heard, because that means my art form will be, I can collaborate and share more openly, and I will reach more. We're all going to benefit from being a more inclusive world. And so that's what's always driven me, other than injustices.
Yeah, it can feel like the arts industries as a whole, it can be very difficult to remain environmentally conscious because so many orchestras and projects look for funding in places that sort of aren't in line with artist values, whether that be from a bank or from an oil company or something. There are a lot of examples of orchestras that look to these sources of funding. And I think it was on the Music Plus podcast, you spoke to Chris Gunnis about a concert tour you did in which you only took public modes of transport and you only took environmentally friendly sponsors. And I was just wondering what your experience of this was and whether you had any advice for musicians looking to fund their projects in an ethical way.
Well, it was a lot harder then when I did that. We're talking about, I did a big concert tour called the Green Keys Tour back in 2010 and 2011, where I toured all of Canada and most of the United States over 1 year, just as you said, using public modes of transportation and offering concerts talking about climate change and performing music on the theme. And I remember in organizing that endeavor, the number one thing was to find sponsorship and find sponsorship that practiced environmentally sustainable activities. I have to say that I was very successful in that respect, finding companies in that there are a lot of companies out there. And I think as musicians, one of the hardest things that we have to do is ask for help. And sometimes when I feel down and in a bad mood, I call it begging. Oh, I have to beg today. But just asking for help in a mutual, agreeable situation where they're helping you financially, and meanwhile they're getting something out of it with exposure of what you're doing, it's a mutually agreeable thing. So I was able to find many sponsors in both nationally and locally that were from businesses that were practicing environmental practices, and we used it as a platform to showcase their work and what they're doing, and organizations in each community. And it really worked out, and I was able to avoid. I didn't have to go to any places that where we say, I guess, call it selling out. I didn't have to sell out or go against my values. And I think it's easier today because more and more companies are doing this. And I think it's really amazing that, yes, a lot of in the past, many traditional cultural and musical institutions and organizations have taken, sort of quote unquote, taken money from the devil, as I like to say. And thankfully, a lot of organizations now have standards in place where they're not doing that. And furthermore, some who have taken it, perhaps in exchange for, say, naming a concert hall, that's starting to reverse, and they're like taking the name away. And I'm like, so like, this is amazing. This is awesome. When I first started off as an environmentalist, honestly, it was a long road, and I thought there's no hope. These organizations are so bound by money from big oil or some coal company or some financial institution that's heavily into funding unsustainable industries, that there's just no way. And even though that still exists, We still have a lot of work to do to call out various cultural organizations and holding them to a higher standard that this is not acceptable. Just like we need to keep holding them account to, making sure their organizations are inclusive, based on gender and on race as well. For me, the environmental thing is for sure. What about orchestras that tour? That's starting to become a thing. It was always very prestigious. Like here in Toronto, we would have the London Symphony come, or the Royal Concertgebouw, or various orchestras from Europe that come on tours. And it's like, with all due respect, and we would celebrate this as a great thing. But now I'm starting to find we're having this conversation, I think, especially because of COVID, now that nothing is happening. And we look outside, and scientists have told us that air pollution is down significantly since we stopped flying everywhere because of the shutdown of the pandemic. And it's just like, you see, this is a world we can live in, and we don't need to have, these types of outdated, archaic models of the way we as musicians do our career in order to have success.
That's really fascinating to hear about your experience with that, because it feels quite often as if we are too scared to ask for alternative methods of funding, and maybe it can feel quite easy to look to someone or look to a company that's funded people before, so that they'll say yes or whatever. But I was just wondering if we could finish with you sharing sort of something you might say to your 21, 22-year-old self in college or university, and if you have a biggest piece of advice for somebody struggling at that kind of age.
Oh, that's a good one. Yeah, I think just thinking about what I was like at that age, for me, everything when I was in my last years of university, everything was all just about the goal, about gaining a certain level of notoriety, for lack of a better word, and also to make money. So it was like, how as a professional musician am I going to get people to notice me and I'm going to make money at the same time? And that's all that mattered to me at that age. And when you're starting off, of course, it's easy to be in this sort of desperate state. But let me tell you something. Now what I've learned, interesting, the most successful I've ever been in my career has definitely been in the last 5 years or so. I don't think it's not a coincidence that because I have stopped thinking about that's the only important thing, now, ironically, this is where I've actually started to get more success. Why? Because I've released pressure off my body, both mentally and physically, emotionally. And because I'm able to function better. I'm able to be more productive. I'm able to compose more. I'm able to compose and put on performances that are more genuine. I think an audience who knows nothing about music can still have a sixth sense when they're looking at a musician and create this emotional connection watching or listening to music, saying, wow, there is something that is attracting me to this performer. And the performer, it works really hard to eliminate all that baggage, is doing something purely from their heart because they're really motivated, not just by money or success or fame, but because they're actually giving something from themselves expressively, that they're willing to share with another human being, that comes off genuinely. And ironically, all the stuff they care about of money and success and notoriety and fame, that will come because of that. But you actually have to get rid of all of that if you're going to make that happen. And that's what I would have told that person. Now, in my defense, would 21-year-old Frank have taken 46-year-old Frank seriously when he told him that? I'm not sure. But I would have definitely told him that nonetheless, saying, hey, here's where I'm at right now. You believe it. And thinking back to that time, I don't remember anybody ever talking to me that way. And I think that was because the institutions that I was part of were really, unfortunately, overemphasizing this very competitive nature that our classical music community is just steeped in, and we have to eliminate this if people are going to be successful and happy and healthy. So,
Well, thank you so much for sharing your incredible story and your vulnerability and wisdom. And I'm sure so many people will resonate with everything you've said. And it's just such a relief to find someone that's open to talking. And thank you for being the first guest, because there was a moment where I worried that nobody would say yes. So the fact that you've said yes and you've just given us so much to think about is wonderful. I'm very grateful to you. So thank you.
Hattie, it's been my pleasure, and I hope that what you started just takes off, and that what we started here today just continues to open up a conversation. So it's been my pleasure to join you.
Thank you. Just before you go, I want to say a huge thank you for listening, and also thank you to Frank for the amazing interview, which I enjoyed so much. If you want to find out more about Frank, his website is frankhorvat.com, and he's on Twitter at Frank Horvat as well, and also has his music on Spotify and Apple Music if you want to check it out. So I guess I'll see you next week. Thank you all so much for listening.